Story 1. So, I have a Halloween trick-or-treating story for you about an utterly terrifying child. No worries if you decide to run it outside of the Halloween season, though, because it takes place actually in February. So that's what made it so eerie at first, the knock on the door, then the little kid standing there in some ghost costume saying trick or treat and holding out his battered pumpkin pail. A lone kid trick-or-treating in a classic ghost costume is kind of creepy on Halloween anyway, but at least it's supposed to be. This was a Friday night in early February, 9 p.m. exactly. Now, in that moment, I was just a bit speechless. I couldn't see what the kid looked like under his little sheet ghost costume, but he was the height and build of a small 6-year-old. He sounded like a boy, and I just kind of dumbly repeated trick or treat at him, and he nodded enthusiastically and said, "Yeah," and shook his little bucket in such a very endearing way. And when he shook it, I could see that he had some other candy in there, I guess, from my nearest neighbors. See, I lived in a very rural suburb property when this all went down, and the houses weren't super close together, but far enough apart that a kid could feasibly walk around the small neighborhood trick-or-treating. At least, that's how the kids did it on Halloween. I hadn't really dealt with one in February before, nor one lone kid this little who wasn't actually accompanied by his parents. I told him to just wait on the porch and then closed the screen door and went back inside and pulled up some Reese's Pieces and put that bag inside of his bucket. And the little kid thanked me extremely politely, actually, and then said, "See you tomorrow, mister." Oh, you would you? I thought to myself, and I spent the next day occasionally sort of laughing to myself at what a clever little scam this kid had cooked up. It was a friendly neighborhood. Who was going to say no to an adorable tiny sheet ghost trick-or-treating in February? And it was so silly and so obvious that it was almost surprising to me that more kids don't try this. And by telling me, "See you tomorrow," he'd given me fair warning to make sure that I had a fresh stock of candy in, and I made sure to grab extra while I was at the store, actually. And it vaguely occurred to me that, as a guy who lived alone in his mid-30s, giving candy to strange lone kids could probably end up being an issue. And I figured as long as the kids stuck to the porch in full view of the neighbors, and since everyone in the area knew each other, it would be fine to give the kid a little bit of candy for his little scam. And besides, my girlfriend stayed over some nights and she was just away for the next while. But I didn't expect this scam to even last until she got back. I figured that there couldn't be any harm in actually entertaining it. But boy was I wrong, but in ways that I couldn't ever predict. Now that night at 9:00 p.m. on the dot, the doorbell rang and the little sheet ghost kid stood there. "Trick or treat, mister?" And then he held up that pail and shook it. He had a decent haul already, it looked like, although nowhere close to what he'd have gotten on Halloween. I laughed, nodded my approval, and then dropped some candy into his bucket. And he thanked me and left with another, "See you tomorrow, mister." Now, this ritual repeated itself for the next week, and by the time the following Friday came around, and the doorbell went to ring at 9 p.m. sharp, I was starting to get a little frustrated, actually. My girlfriend was set to come back into town the next day, and I had to actually get her from the airport, so I needed to be up at like 4 a.m. And I'd also somehow convinced myself that this kid's candy scam, no matter how sweet and endearing it actually was, would last exactly 7 days and be over by the time my girl got back. I hadn't mentioned the weird ghost kid to her in our calls, and now it felt kind of odd having to explain that a kid was trick-or-treating at our house almost every night in February. And yeah, it had been happening while you were away. And no, I didn't mention it because reasons, I guess. Really, I could have just explained exactly this, that I expected the kid to get bored before he did, but I was looking for reasons to be annoyed that night. Now, when I opened the door, the kid said his usual trick or treat and held up his bucket. And when he shook it, I saw that he had a whole bunch of candy this time. Now, I rolled my eyes and said something about how the scam was clearly paying off, buddy. And the kid made a sort of confused, "Huh?" And against my better judgment, it caused me to snap a little. I told him that it had been cute and funny to start with, but that I'd give him a bunch of candy so he could at least respect my intelligence and acknowledge that it's an actual scam. And I told him that you don't trick-or-treat in February, and asked him to confirm that he knew it wasn't actually Halloween, right? And when I asked this question, the kid then lowered his bucket, and then lowered his head like he was sad. And through his little ghost costume, I just heard him mutter that I wasn't supposed to ask that. Now, a little bit of a chill ran down my spine, as I suddenly realized that this felt like I was in some type of Arno sleep story. And goddamn, if only it had been some kind of supernatural curse story, then maybe I wouldn't be dealing with the injuries that I have to this day. Instead, the kid looked back up at me through his little ghost costume and began laughing in a way that was clearly tormenting and cruel. And then I heard a creak from the porch on my right. And another much older kid stepped around the side of the house and said, "You don't ask that 'cause I said so." And then before I could react, this tall, wiry teenager started punching me with some kind of brass knuckle made out of a chain, and the blows were agony. I immediately fell to the ground, and then took a flurry of these kicks. And the whole time, that obnoxious ghost child I could hear laughing with some type of glee. I've been so blindsided by the attack that I hadn't even thought to yell or scream. And now, I finally did. And the teen attacking me responded by stomping on my spine, kicking me in the ribs, and leaping off of the porch. I vaguely saw the little ghost kid climb onto the teenager's back like some type of piggyback ride, and then they run off into the darkness. And as quick as I could, I started to drag myself to my feet and called the cops. They got there surprisingly fast for where I was, and eventually accompanied me to the local hospital so I could get checked out. I had a couple broken ribs, and my spine's never been quite right since that attack. I think the cops said that it was the third similar report of kids doing this in the county. And when we checked with my immediate neighbors, none of them had actually been visited by the ghost kid or his violent older brother. And so it seemed like the whole thing had been targeted at my place. At first, I was completely baffled because the kids didn't steal anything. The older one just beat me violently, and then they both left. And the only thing they'd really gotten out of it was just a little bit of free candy. Now, I kept harassing the cops, saying maybe I was in danger. Maybe the kids would come back. And eventually, a detective did come to visit me and told me that he wasn't strictly supposed to let me know this, but he would if it would set my mind at ease. Basically, the working theory was that it was some kind of gang initiation. The teenager who beat on me would accompany the little kid until their target challenged them on the fact that it wasn't Halloween. And then there'd be an attack, and the attacker would be initiated into said gang. And from what the cops were working on, the attacker in each case had been a different guy, but the ghost kid. They thought that that was the same little kid each time. The detective told me on the download that they suspected that the ghost kid was the gang leader's own son, and supposedly as much of a psycho as his old man. So, this class act was getting his own little kid to lead gang initiations. And I'd just been an unknowing schlub who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I never really heard any more about it, or any more reports of this kind of gang initiation. So, maybe they realized that it drew too much attention. I guess I've got to be thankful that they settled on something a little childish and not actually fatal, instead of the usual murder a guy and urine kind of thing. On the other hand, it kinda sucks to think about kids being initiated into these gangs in the first place, even older teenagers. But when I think about that ghost kid laughing as I got pounded on and beaten, there's no doubt in my mind that this kid's mind was already long gone into the darkness. And I pity anyone who encounters him as he becomes an adult. Story 2 music. So I've got a story for you about a time when I was a young kid myself, and we encountered a strange child. I think this is genuinely the scariest thing that's ever actually happened to me. And if I get sick, like a fever or anything, this is always the thing I have nightmares about if I'm gonna have them. So I figured that I'd try and exorcise them by writing to you about it. So this was back in the 90s, which was the best time to be a kid, because it just was. This happened in like 97, and life was just simpler and more relaxed back then. Things really changed everywhere after the beginning of the 2000s. I think we all know why. And it's not just nostalgia talking for me. Things changed before that. This summer of 97, though, and when I think back on it, I picture it like a movie. Me and my 4 buddies, 3 other guys, 1 girl. We didn't have some cool nickname like the Losers Club in it, or the Goonies. And I don't even remember if the kids were called the Goonies in that movie. But anyway, we didn't have a cool team name. We were just kind of the gang. It was me, James, Barry, Pat, and Kendall. That summer, we spent most of the time exploring our rural neighborhood, playing various made-up games in fields and forests, and just having a good time. We built a fort. We made a dam. We rode our bikes. We had picnics. We were all aged 8 to 10 and wanted the summer to last forever. Or at least until our quarters ran out at the arcade, or it got cold, or one of us almost died. Unfortunately, it's the last one that brought an end to our summer of fun. We met the strange kid on a Monday. We knew him for 5 days. He said his name was Russell. At the time, we were finishing up our fort in the forest, so we let Russell tag along because he asked. Now, he seemed younger than us, and he said that he just moved into the area. He had a pretty cool new bike, which at the time I didn't find suspicious. And now when I look back on it, though, I think Russell probably stole that bike. You see, Russell was a super unkempt and scruffy kid. Like his clothes were almost rags. And I don't mean like some old Victorian kid. Just typical normal 90s kid clothes. But they were super torn and dirty and hand-me-down. They made Russell look like he came from a family that my sister would have called dirt poor. Russell came to hang out with us every day that week and disappeared at dinner time like clockwork. Now, when Barry and I mentioned Russell in front of my mom, she said that she thought that he must be part of the farming family who'd moved into the farm down the way. He wasn't, as it turns out, but it was a good guess. He was just some other random neighborhood kid who'd recently started hanging around. On Friday, Russell begged and pleaded with us to come with him and see something cool that he'd found. We had plans to carve our initials into the trees that day, but it could wait. So, we let Russell lead us around the outskirts of some fields that we weren't really supposed to cut through. Eventually, after we crossed through a little area of trees we'd never been in and had to balance our way over a small stream, we reached the destination Russell had in mind. It was a massive sinkhole. I'd heard about the sinkhole in the area. We'd all been vaguely warned to stay away from it, but none of us actually knew where it was. Now, Russell had led us right to it. And more to the point, he was sort of waxing poetic about how he lived down in the hole. "No, you don't," Kendall said to him. Russell insisted that yes, he did. He lived down in the sinkhole. According to him, you jumped into the sinkhole and it teleported you to his home, a magical place called Salt City, where they had arcade machines on free play, and it was super awesome. And then he said he'd show us as long as one of us jumped down the sinkhole. Of course, we all knew this was insane. None of us wanted to go near the sinkhole, let alone jump down in it. And we were way too old to believe in magical teleporters to places called Salt City. I guess Russell had heard the name Salt Lake City before and decided Salt City sounded like an appealing alternative. But when you think about it, it's hardly the magical kingdom of Terabithia, is it? Salt City? I mean, come on now. Anyways, Russell was hooting and hollering about the Salt City this and Salt City that, and demanding that we jump down in that sinkhole to go there with him. At first, it didn't dawn on us to ask why Russell wanted to throw ourselves down a hole, which would most certainly result in our deaths. So, we started playing along, grilling him about this salt city as we walked around the edges of that sinkhole. Not too close, though, vaguely aware that there was a danger Russell might try and push one of us in. Why wouldn't he jump in? We asked. Because he was saving the teleports for us, he said. How did he leave each day to come play with us? Magic, etc. And it was all just complete nonsense. And eventually Kendall whispered to me that maybe it was a bit dangerous that Russell wanted us to do this, and we should probably tell an adult. I agreed. So, I tried to get the other 3 to come with us. James had gotten real argumentative with Russell, though, and was trying to get him to jump down if he was so insistent. I whispered to James that if Russell actually did it, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And that's when I think James finally grasped the gravity of the situation. Russell was trying to persuade us to do something extremely dangerous to ourselves. And any kid who would do that wasn't someone we wanted to be friends with, obviously. We decided to leave Russell to his little hole. And unfortunately, Russell got really angry and belligerent about this, and tried to grab James and actually drag him back towards that sinkhole. Like suddenly, this little kid went all feral, deciding, I guess, that he was going to throw James down this sinkhole and be responsible for whatever came after. I have no idea. I do know that I realized James was in severe and immediate danger because despite being younger than us, Russell was stronger than he looked. He was managing to actually drag James towards the sinkhole, and none of us wanted to rush in and get too close in case the hole started to widen. And so I did the only thing that I could think to do. I grabbed the nearest thing I could off the ground, which happened to be a small log, and threw it at Russell when I had an opening. And my aim was true. The log hit Russell square in the temple and sent him reeling and staggering back. So much so, in fact, that he staggered right towards the edge of the sinkhole itself. Thankfully, James managed to grab Russell's arm and pull him forward. Russell collapsed onto the ground on the edge of the sinkhole, and we all crept over to see the damage. Russell seemed to be unconscious. His temple was bloody where the log had hit him, and a little bit of blood was also coming out of the corner of his mouth. And in that moment, we made a decision. This kid had been trying to persuade us to do something incredibly cruel, and then try to potentially murder James. We had no idea who he was, or who his family was. On the other hand, we'd get in a whole mountain of trouble if we told anyone that we'd been to that sinkhole. And it was our word against Russell about what had happened. We decided to just leave him unconscious at the sinkhole and run away. Let me tell you guys, if you're ever faced with a choice between coming clean about something or living with the guilt of hiding it, always pick the former. I spent 5 years with his secret weighing on us, with no idea if we'd killed Russell, or if we could have saved him, or anything. 5 years of nightmares, guilt, and terror, when Russell was simply not around, on the next day, or the next, or the next. And by then, we were all too scared to say anything. It became our secret, something we all avoided mentioning to each other unless we absolutely had to. And by the time high school rolled around, we were absolutely certain that we'd killed a kid in the summer of 1997, and would be our secret that we took to the grave. After 2 years of high school, when most of us were in our junior year, the freshman class started, and Russell was among them. We found out because this kid with a mullet and a Scorpions t-shirt came up to us during lunch and was like, "Hey, aren't you the kids that I had a fight with at one summer and nearly threw into a sinkhole?" So, sorry about that, guys. Now, Russell's theory was that he had heat stroke or something that day because he has no idea why he tried to persuade us to jump down the sinkhole. He just genuinely enjoyed hanging with us that week, and that day, he just says that he had this strong, severe compulsion to lead us to the hole and tell us that nonsensical story. And we'd spent the previous 5 years believing that we'd killed him and being too scared of getting in trouble to try and find out who he was. He'd spent the previous 5 years feeling so guilty that he'd never tried to find out who we were. And we all just kind of laughed about it in the end, and even hung out with Russell a bunch after that. Although not often, because he had his own group of friends, and we were different ages. It was such a strange relief. I don't recommend keeping a dark secret like that to anyone. And like I said, if I have fever dream nightmares, this is what I dream about. How much worse things could have been for all of us if any of the events had played out differently. How stupid of us it was to just leave Russell there. But also, I think most of all, I get haunted by the story Russell told us. How that day, maybe because of heat stroke, he just had this strong, pressing compulsion to tell us all to jump in that hole. It makes me wonder whether if we'd walked closer to that edge, we would have felt the pull of the abyss, too. A man of many names and shifting story. 3 identities. The figure later called the Chameleon Killer drifted across states and decades, quietly weaving himself into the lives of unsuspecting families. Each move left faint traces, odd disappearances, unanswered questions, and a puzzle that investigators would struggle to connect for years. Who he really was remained a mystery long after he was gone. Listen to the rest of the story over on my True Crime channel, Saturn Soul. Link down below. Music. So, I wanted to write to you today to finally share a story that happened to me when I was a little kid back in the 1990s. It caused a big rift in my family at the time for reasons that you'll soon see. And it involved my single aunt, who was my dad's sister, and her daughter Serena, my cousin. My parents weren't married when they had me, and for a long time they said they didn't need some official piece of paper to show their commitment to one another. Well, eventually, I guess they did, in fact, need some official piece of paper for some reason or another. So they decided that if they were going to get married, they'd do it properly. I was a little bridesmaid to my own mom, and it was a little girl's dream. The whole day felt like some magic fairy tale. The only part of the memory that I have that feels more like a nightmare is remembering my cousin Serena lurking on the outskirts of the wedding, dressed in black and sort of scowling at me. I remember her whispering to me that it physically hurt her to be inside the church for the service, and then, later, at the reception, telling me that she was never going to get married, and people who got married were lame, and she'd never commit to one person, except for her, one true Lord, Satan. Serena was a 15-year-old emo teen. I was a 6-year-old princess wannabe, and so I believed every word my older, and therefore obviously smarter cousin told me. Also, Mom and Dad had told me that I had to become friends with Serena, because I was going to be staying with her and Auntie June while they went on their honeymoon. So, it was like Serena would be my sister for a while. Serena had been there when they said this, and she acted very excited and happy about it, and didn't mention Satan, or how being in church hurt her soul, or any of the insanity that was to follow. Her dressing in black was a bit of an eccentricity. My dad said, a word that I didn't know at the time, but I kinda liked. And he said that Auntie June had been like that when she was a kid, too. And now Auntie June was the nicest, sweetest person we knew, wasn't she? I agreed. Auntie June was lovely and nice and sweet, and I remembered Serena being nice and sweet, too. And she hadn't worn black, or even scaled the other times that I'd met her. And this was a recent thing. At the wedding, I asked her if it had always burned her soul to go inside a church like she was claiming, and she said yes. But I knew that she had been at my baptism when I was a baby, and I never heard about her getting burned then. She told me that the only reason she didn't catch fire at the wedding is because she'd performed sacred rites to protect her soul from God. I didn't really understand any of this at the time, but I knew that I've been taught that God was good and loving. So I was very confused why Serena would be scared of him. I think even at 6, I knew she was lying to some degree, and maybe just sort of play acting. I definitely didn't take it seriously, or think it was scary, or even think much of it at all, though. I thought she was cool, and I was excited to spend the next nearly 3 weeks with her and Auntie June in their house on Millick Road, where Auntie June and Serena promised me they'd made me an exciting bedroom that would be mine for the whole time that I was there. I'd previously been told that I was going to share with Serena, so I was a little bit disappointed that I'd have my own room instead. But when I mentioned this to Mom and Dad, Mom just said that Auntie June had told them it would be for the best if I had the guest room. The first couple of days with my aunt and cousin were just normal fun days. I'd either spent time being fussed over by Auntie June or Serena when Auntie June had to go out to work. It was summer vacation, but not for Auntie June, obviously. And June sometimes worked in the evenings, and then Serena would have to babysit me, sort of. June said that she'd try to switch to as many day shifts as possible, but there would be some nights when she wasn't there. It was on the 3rd day staying there that I had my first overnight with Serena, and that's when she dimmed the living room lights and told me to scooch in close and listen real good, because she had to tell me something important. I listened, excited to hear what she was going to say. And she told me their house was haunted. Now, I assumed this was some kind of game, because Mom and Dad had told me many times that ghosts weren't real, so I played along and acted shocked. Serena didn't seem to think that I was taking it very seriously, though, so she tried to stress how scary and dangerous it was. When I kept giggling and talking about ghosts that I'd seen in cartoons, she switched it up, telling me that ghosts were working for demons, and of course, demons came from hell, so I had to take these seriously. Otherwise, Satan would claim my soul. I reminded her that she told me that she'd pledged her soul to Satan at the wedding, and she called me a smartass. And then she got all very serious and told me that I had to really believe her now. She said that she'd pledged her soul to Satan in order to save me, because someone, she didn't know who, was planning to sacrifice me to the demons. And eventually, this started to upset me a little bit. And I guess Serena got the reaction she wanted, because the more upset I got, the more she continued. I don't remember the exact details, but she started telling me some very dark horror movie things. How the demons were going to take me down to hell and slowly peel my skin off, eat my soul, and it would be because someone had sold my soul to Satan. Serena said that she pledged her own soul to Satan to protect me, and that's why she avoided churches, and why she dressed in black. And then she showed me a pentagram that she'd drawn on her arm in Sharpie, and told me it was the Dark Lord's mark. It was all very silly. But you know when you're a little kid, and an older kid is trying to upset you. So it does, even though you don't really believe them, or care. I think that's what happened at first anyway. And then Serena said it was really important that we work out who had sold my soul to Satan, because the only way we could have both of our souls would be to break their pact. That night, Serena let me stay up too late, so I was overly tired anyway. I remember I had nightmares, and kept waking up afraid of bumps in the night, and ghosts in the house. I was a really rational, grounded child, but even I was starting to wonder if there was something to Serena's story. After all, why would she be lying about this? Over the next few days, I spent a lot of time with Auntie June. Serena wasn't around much, and when she was, her and Auntie June kept having arguments that escalated into screaming. And whenever these would begin, June would send me into the other room to watch TV, or ask me to do some chore in the garden. But I heard enough to hear Serena accusing June of being wicked, evil, and controlling. And the next time Serena babysat for me during one of June's night shifts, she told me that her mother was an evil woman who mistreated her, and that she thought that it was her who'd sold my soul to Satan. Now, I found this very hard to believe because June was lovely, and very kind to me, and she could be pretty scary when she was arguing with Serena that was true. I told Serena my skepticism while also trying not to offend her, and she looked upset and said that she understood, because Satan's minions are very convincing. It still confused me that Serena had claimed to be Satan's minion at the wedding. But I guess I was too young to maybe start tripleg guessing theories about who was behind what demonic pact, especially when I didn't really believe in any of it, other than that people were mad at each other and wanted me to be scared about something. And just over a week had passed when Serena babysat me again, and this time she told me that she had definitive proof that Auntie June had been the one to sell my soul to Satan. In the last few days, I'd spent a lot of time with June out of the house, and she'd even taken me to the store the day before and bought me a new toy. So I was pretty convinced that she hadn't sold my soul to Satan. I also hadn't seen any evidence of the ghosts or demons that apparently infested the house, according to Serena. But again, she explained that this was because she'd signed her own pact with Satan to protect us. I had overheard June and Serena arguing about me, though. Serena had accused her of giving me a lot of attention and trying to get her claws into me, which did sound scary. Admittedly, it was very hard to know who to believe when, in my eyes, they were both adults. Obviously, now I know that I should have just told June what was going on right away. But hey, I was a kid. And so that night, Serena took us into Auntie June's bedroom, which is where we weren't supposed to go. It was always locked, but Serena knew a way to pick the lock using magic, she said. Although, when she told me to look away so my soul wouldn't be corrupted, I saw her slip a key out of her pocket. Inside, she showed me the evidence. June had horror novels on her bookshelf and on a board in her room. There was an old Polaroid photo of Auntie June, dressed as a witch, standing next to a devil who looked suspiciously like my dad in a Halloween costume. Serena insisted this was real photographic evidence of her mother at an old coven meeting where she'd committed herself to Satan, though, and I was less impressed by the horror novels. Some of the covers were generally very scary to me, and I didn't understand how someone like Auntie June would want or allow things like that in the house. I'm really not quite sure why this was the deciding piece of evidence for me that began to sway me, but it was. I've been so rational and sensible up until then, but seeing all that terrifying imagery sitting on June's bookshelf, somehow Serena was able to persuade me that it did in fact prove there was an evil side to Auntie June. I still didn't believe any of the Satan nonsense or about the pacts or selling my soul or anything like that. I think Serena knew that, though, because she changed the angle of her story a bit, and now it was more about stopping Auntie June from doing bad things to us in general, and that she was secretly a wicked, abusive woman, and that we had to help her purify her soul. We left the bedroom, and Serena locked it up behind her again, making me look away to save my soul while she did the magic. And then she took me into my bedroom. We never went into Serena's bedroom either. She said that it was because that's where the ghost congregated, and it would scare me to see all the things that she had to surround herself with due to her selfless pact with Satan. Serena told me to sit on the bed and wait while she went to her room and got something. And while she was gone, I heard some bangs and crashes in the hallway that I think were supposed to sound like ghosts, but were clearly just Serena. And then eventually she returned and had a small baggie with 3 berries in it. She held them up and looked me very seriously in the face and told me that these were holy berries blessed by God and that we needed to make sure Auntie June ingested them. But because I always did the cooking with her lately, I had to slip them into her food somehow. Serena made me promise that I would. She'd made me swear on my life and the lives of my mother and father. I kept my toes crossed and swore. And now, like I said, I wasn't a stupid kid. I knew that whatever Serena was asking me to do here wasn't a great idea. I also knew that berries could be dangerous. The part that I couldn't really get my head around is why Serena would want me, her cousin, who she was supposed to love, to harm her mother, who she was supposed to love. It didn't really compute to me that they could be really dangerous, and that's why I didn't take things as seriously as I should have. Also, I was like 6, remember? I wish I could say in Serena's defense here that I really can't be sure that she intended for me to go ahead with it. I want to remember there being some hesitance that she was unsure, maybe told me to just do it if I was able to, etc. But I can't. She was very strongly adamant that I'd do it. Like I said, she made me swear. She told me specifically to put them into the fruit salad that Auntie June made, which only she ate because there would be blueberries in there. But she also told me that if anything happened, she wouldn't tell me what. She just said that I'd know. Then I had to say that it was me who gave Auntie June the berries. Otherwise, it would undo the breaking of the pact. So Serena had very clearly set me up to get in trouble, and then coached me into taking the blame. The problem was simply that I didn't know how serious it all was. What I did was wait until late that night, when everyone had gone to bed. And then I went to use the bathroom and took the baggie with me. And my plan was to simply flush them away, and then tell Serena that I'd done what she asked, and nobody would be any the wiser. And I even thought that I was really smart because I thought ahead and knew that if I just dropped the berries down the toilet, they might not flush away. So I crushed them in my hand and wiped the mulch off and flushed that away. And I even tasted a little taste of the juice on my tongue, just in case they had actually been blueberries all along, and they were not. And then I made sure I scrubbed my hands very clean of any evidence of the purple staining and went to bed. And the next thing I clearly remember is waking up in a hospital with these terrible, terrible stomach pains and barely being able to breathe. And then I remember drifting in and out of consciousness, and doctors and nurses in a panic. And at one point, Auntie June pacing back and forth, asking me if I'd eaten anything I shouldn't have. And at this point, I was just about coherent enough to tell her the story about Serena and the berries, even though I felt awful telling on my cousin. I told her I hadn't eaten them, though, and just crushed it and licked it a little bit. So I didn't think that's why I was so sick. Again, memories continued to be vague here, but I remember Auntie June and Serena screaming at each other in the hospital, and then another voice yelling at both of them. I remember having to drink some disgusting black liquid, and everyone acting a little relieved, even though I didn't feel like I was getting any better at all. I spent a couple of days very sad and scared and struggling in that hospital until my parents came back early from their honeymoon, and I'd never been more relieved to see them. So yeah, my cousin Serena tried to get me to poison my aunt with deadly nightshade, and because I was too sensible and serious a kid to let her convince me to do it, but too naive to believe that it could be anything too dangerous, I ended up giving myself some very minor deadly nightshade poisoning. It could have been a hell of a lot worse. I could have ended myself, or worse, I could have ended up killing my aunt. And I'm not sure that I would have ever been able to forgive myself for that. No matter how much people tell me that it wouldn't have been my fault, I'm not sure that I would have been able to accept that as true. One thing that was true, though, was that Serena had tried to convince me to poison her mother, and her actions had led me to getting mildly poisoned instead. So, of course, everyone wanted to know why and what the hell had happened. I didn't really follow or understand what was going on at the time, being so young. I just recovered in the hospital and was told that I wouldn't be seeing Serena or Auntie June again. Later, this changed, but that's what Dad told me. Pretty angry at the time. And I think a part of me had become scared of Auntie June after all the things Serena had told me in the horror novels on her bookshelf, because I just remember being glad that I wouldn't have to deal with any of that again while I was focused on just getting better. And here's how everything eventually played out, though. It turned out that Auntie June had been severely struggling with Serena for about a year. Out of the blue, she'd gone from a well-behaved and kind girl into a monster. June was barely coping with her, but didn't want to admit it to anyone in case they judged her. She knew that Serena had always genuinely cared about her little cousin, so she thought that me going to stay there during my parents' honeymoon might heal the rift between them, and instead, it made things worse. My dad was extremely angry at his sister for withholding how serious Serena's behavior had become. Apparently, Serena had used physical violence against June shortly before my stay, and all Dad could focus on was the fact that I'd been endangered. It didn't take long to realize he was being harsh on Auntie June. Serena wasn't just a troubled teen, it turned out. She was eventually diagnosed with a handful of serious mental illnesses and underwent prolonged psychiatric inpatient treatment. At one point early on, Dad was adamant that they pushed for an attempted murder charge against Serena, especially because she seemed extremely unrepentant at the time. And when it was discovered how mentally sick and suffering she was, that was soon dropped. Eventually, the rifts mended. Life was very hard for Serena, but she eventually overcame her demons. Actually joke about this and leads a somewhat normal, if unconventional, life. We are very close friends, and she knows that I'm sharing the story. We have a kind of attitude about it, where we'll both get a kick out of it if it somehow manages to appear on an actual Let's Read video. So hopefully that proves that despite it being a completely terrifying, horrific experience for everyone involved, it did at least have a happy ending. Music Story 4. A lot of people have stories about that one kid from their school days who was just the freaking worst. My story goes places. The kid in question wasn't who was scary. He wanted to be scary. He wanted to be really intimidating, and he wanted the rest of us to be scared of him. He was new to school, and a proper short-ass little guy alone on a new place in the middle of year 7. So, I can see why he decided to front, and he was such an oddball. So, this kid was new at our school, and he had an attitude that stank, and he decided he wasn't going to fit in. He wasn't going to try and be anybody's friend. Instead, he wanted us to fear him. So, he picked someone to emulate that he thought we'd find badass and scary. Unfortunately, that person was Fred Durst. Now, let me set the scene. I was just an average year 7 girl doing average things, watching all of this play out. Durst was this short, puny little year 7 who was short for even our 11, 12-year-old ages. He had a baby-faced and blonde hair, and he'd storm around the school doing the nookie walk from the Limp Bizkit video, literally acting like Fred Durst, just scowling at people and saying the F word if you got too close. The teacher said that he had behavioral issues, but as you can probably guess, as little kids, we found Durst hilarious. And yes, he did insist that everyone call him Durst. Limp Bizkit is kind of hard to explain to anyone who wasn't a kid during that era. They were a really weird band, in that they were pretty universally regarded as terrible. All their early albums received mid to terrible reviews, and they were voted worst band of 2000 by some magazine. I remember even among the Metalheads, the new Metalheads, the Korn and Slipknot fans, Limp Bizkit was not particularly considered cool or good. This also took place in 2004, so their 4th album had just come out, the one with Behind Blue Eyes on it. But Durst only had their 2nd album, Significant Other, and then later, Chocolate Starfish in the hot dog-flavored water, which is a key plot point in the story. Now, basically, if you weren't a tween in 2004, let me try and explain. The kid was obsessed with a rebel band and tried to use them as a source of fear and coolness. 3 years after they'd stopped being particularly musically relevant. And many of us believed this would last forever and that they'd never have a revival. Well, Fred Durst buddies have proven us all wrong in 2024, and 25 with a Limp Bizkit renaissance. Does our friend Durst get a similar revival? Well, you'll find out. So this little kid would strut through the corridors of our secondary school, snarling and scowling at people, wearing a red baseball cap that no teacher could get him to take off for love nor money. He prided himself on singing along to Limp Bizkit's second album, Significant Other, which he played through a battery-powered portable CD player with terrible tiny Coke speakers attached in the headphone port. And no matter how many times the teachers tried to confiscate Durr's CD player or ban him from listening to Limp Bizkit, he somehow managed to steal it back within a day and would have returned to blasting Significant Other through the corridors, hallways, and classrooms of our secondary school. I think the teachers would have taken him more seriously if the rest of us hadn't constantly mocked and made fun of him. And eventually, Durst didn't care that we weren't afraid of him. He went from trying to be hard to trying to be the class clown. Any attention was good attention to him, and we would constantly goad him and bait him into making himself look like an idiot. And for his part, he was getting easy and free attention like he wanted. I know for a fact that Durst wasn't some mentally ill kid or anything. He didn't come from a troubled home, and he was just a little back then. I don't know if it's still the case in British secondary schools these days, but back in my day when I was in school, doing music class was compulsory. For the first couple of years of secondary school, we didn't really learn much. It was kind of an unstructured class. Sometimes we'd play around on instruments. Other times, we'd all have to sing. And then sometimes, we'd be taught vague musical history lessons or vague attempts to teach us what musical score was. Music class was basically a free muckabout session, and we all loved it, not least because of our teacher, Mrs. Beaton. She was a proper sweet old granny type, clearly still working as a music teacher because she enjoyed it. And I went to a fairly rural school, and I think that if she taught in a bigger city school, Mrs. Beaton would have been forced into retirement many years before. But my school was kind of small, kind of underfunded, and didn't exactly have a wealth of music teachers queuing up at its door. Mrs. Beaton never lost her temper ever, and she was maybe the only teacher who really genuinely tried with Durst. I guess because his bizarre Limp Bizkit fascination was music-related, and she thought maybe she could reach him by trying to be nice to him and encourage him to listen to other music. This didn't work, of course. Durst would just turn up Significant Other, usually nookie or break stuff. And I swear that thanks to Durst, I'd hear those two songs more than any other music during 2004. Let me just reiterate, this album came out in 1999. Limp Bizkit had 4 albums out by 2004. Durst just only owned this one, at least for most of the story. So Mrs. Beaton tried really hard to be nice to Durst, and he was rude as hell to her, and she never once got angry at him or raised her voice or anything. Oh, there's one thing that I haven't mentioned about Durst's copy of Significant Other. Yet. It was the censored version, so all the swear words were just muted out hilariously, and his parents wouldn't allow him to own the uncensored version back in the day in case it was a bad influence. And I first met them back at Parents' Evening of that year. They were at the table next to mine, and I heard them describing their son as spirited and enthusiastic to a teacher who was explaining to them that, no, he was incredibly disruptive and badly behaved. They seemed actively shocked at this, which was the first time I discovered that his whole Durst act was mostly only at school. And this was before the Mrs. Beaton incident. So, back to that. Every time he'd disrespect Mrs. Beaton, the rest of the class would get particularly mad at Durst. We started calling him Durst the Worst, which I think is a nickname Fred himself probably heard often. But despite us trying to use it as an insult, Durst loved being called Durst the Worst. And because we were stupid kids, we didn't realize that we were only encouraging him and rewarding his attention-seeking behavior. So, a typical music lesson would kind of go something like this. Mrs. Beaton would say, "Hello, class." Something. Something. Dance macabre. Something. Something. Teacher voice. Oasis and blurb something. Something. And then she'd sigh and add something about Limp Bizkit. She tried her very best to incorporate Limp Bizkit into her music theory lessons, knowing that Durst would just bring them up anyway. Then Durst would hear Limp Bizkit and take it as a sign to yell, "I did it all for the nookie. Come on, the nookie." Or, "I'ma grab a chainsaw," or something similar. And then we'd all yell at him to shut up, Durst the worst. And then he'd rap back at us in a bad approximation of Fred Durst. And then, eventually, we were all disrupting the lesson, not just Durst. So Mrs. Beaton would clap her hands together politely and ask for gentle, calm, quiet. And that was her catchphrase. And of course, none of us wanted to upset Mrs. Beaton, our beloved teacher. So we'd all calm down. Then Durst generally kept the swearing to corridor moments, because it was the only thing the teachers couldn't just let fly, I guess. So in other classes, his disruptive behavior usually involved the lines I quoted above, or he'd self-censor to avoid getting into too much trouble. Not the case in Mrs. Beaton's class, though. He knew lovely old Mrs. Beaton would never actually punish him. So he used this opportunity to say the full range of F-bombs and birds that you would hear in their music. And you could see that it genuinely bothered Mrs. Beaton every time he did so. Like, whenever he said the F-word, she'd twitch a little and tell him it was harmful to use language like that. As some example of how powerfully sweet Mrs. Beaton was, Durst even listened occasionally, and he would usually stop swearing once he saw that he offended her too much. The main event happened on the day we came back from half-term break. It was the final half-term of Year 7, which means Durst had been at the school for around 6 months. He joined after the Christmas holidays, hence why he was the insecure new kid acting like a weirdo. It felt like he'd been the main character of our entire school forever, though, even though this must have just been because he was in my class. Looking back, it was obvious that the situation couldn't go on forever, and that something would have to be done about Durst eventually to stop him disrupting our entire school lives. And I sometimes wonder what things would have been like if the Mrs. Beaton incident hadn't happened. Maybe Durst would have moved on to Lincoln Park, or called himself Shinoda, and become a very different person. And that day, back after the summer half-term though, he was still Durst, but there was something different about him. We all recognized it right away because he'd been spinning Significant Other every single day for 6 months. But I particularly recognized it because my older sister had other Limp Bizkit albums. So I'd heard it before when it came out in 2001, or whenever it was. And the thing I'm talking about is Limp Bizkit's third album, Chocolate Starfish and Hot Dog Flavored Water. Durst had the CD. He was listening to it, jamming to Roland Air Raid Vehicle. And in fact, a smug and excited look on his face, as if it was a brand new album. And this was his first time hearing it. Turns out that it actually was the case. He'd literally been gifted it for the first time on the way to school that day. In amongst his usual snarls and spinning his red cap on his finger, Durst would point to his CD player during form room and say things like, "New album, and good, huh?" to anyone who came close. Of course, we all psyched him up, asking him about it and asking him which his favorite tracks were and things. And it was clear he loved Roll In and Take a Look Around, which to be fair was a banger, because those were the 2 songs he kept playing over and over, and singing along to the latter in particular. When he was listening to Roland for the 5th time, though, I noticed something. Not only did Durst have a second Limp Bizkit album now, it was also the uncensored version. Yep, Fred let loose with a full barrage of cuss words on this album. And for anyone who knows the Chocolate Starfish album, you can probably understand why this is significant and where it's going. If you don't, well then, stay tuned, because music was our last lesson of the day. And for most of the day, we saw Durst strutting through corridors or in some of our classes, rapping along to Roland, snarling at year 11s, and doing some kind of nude dance to this day that I don't think Fred Durst ever did, and I'm pretty sure it was from that one Bloodhound Gang song. But for whatever reason, Durst did that dance along to Roland. I'd been listening curiously all day, wondering if Durst would dare to play the title track of the album in front of the teachers. I remember my sister playing it to me when I was in primary school, and telling me that I had to promise not to tell Mom and Dad that she'd let me hear it. And we both found it hilariously, stupidly funny sitting in her room, listening to Fred Dare screaming those lyrics, which if you don't know them, well, again, stay tuned. And Kid Durst did not play Hot Dog in front of the teachers, or at all. He just listened to the middle few tracks of the album over and over again, creating his usual mini tornado of musical chaos as he Durst walked through the halls. As usual, everyone laughed at the weird little Limp Bizkit kid doing his weird little Limp Bizkit routine. And as usual, Durst thought that he was intimidating as all frick and the coolest kid on campus. And when we all showed up for music class, things were suspiciously quiet and calm. And that's because Durst was late to class. Mrs. Beaton took the register and asked if Durst was out today. One of us said no. He was in school. But she just shrugged and began the lesson, which today was going to involve listening to some classical music and talking about Tchaikovsky. I don't remember if that really is what it was, but something like that probably. And Mrs. Beaton gave me some preamble and then sat down at her desk and put her hand on the CD player. It was like Durst timed his arrival for that moment. In my memory, looking back, I would swear that I could hear the faint sounds of the intro track. Who's in the house? Limp Bizkit is in the house, drifting in from the corridor as Durst made his way to class. And then, as track 1 became track 2, he slammed the door open, stepped in, and slammed it shut behind him. Then, with a bow and a flourish, Durst interrupted our music class with a memorized word-perfect sing-along to Limp Bizkit's titular track, Hot Dog. I won't quote the whole song, obviously. I can't quote the whole song on YouTube, but I remember once hearing that Hot Dog held the world record for the most number of F-bombs used in a song, at least for a while. It is also a direct parody of the Nine Inch Nails song Closer, and quotes that song as well as Perfect Drug, and other Nine Inch Nails classics in the chorus. But here are some highlights of the 2-minute 10 seconds performance we got from Durst music class that day in front of the sweet beloved OAP music teacher, Mrs. Beaton. Get the F up. It's an effed up world in an effed up place. Everybody's judged by their effed up face. And then about 10 similar lines, and something about DJ Lethal. Ain't it a shame that you can't say the F and the F, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, I don't remember the song from memory. I had to look up the lyrics, but it's burned into my mind watching Durst caper and leap about the class, his crappy speakers hanging around his neck, doing a dance that wasn't even from Limp Bizkit. It's burned into my mind how we all cheered him on and got raucous every time he said the F word, which is a lot in this song. And it's burned into my mind how none of us dared to even look at Mrs. Beaton the entire time, because surely even she would be furious at Durst for this insanity. And Durst finished with a flourish of just know that nothing you do can bring you closer to me. And the class fell silent, and that's when we all knew, Durst included, that this had gone too far this time, that the whole class should probably be ashamed. I turned to look at Mrs. Beaton to see what the teacher's reaction to Durst's disruption and constant use of the F-bomb was. She was sitting at her desk, staring ahead, breathing heavily. Durst just sort of stood there, looking defeated and pathetic. It was the most normal human behavior I'd ever seen from him. Even took his cap off and muttered, "Sorry, miss," and went to sit down. And Mrs. Beaton was still staring ahead, breathing heavily. She didn't even look at Durst as he went and sat down and looking a bit sheepish. And that's when I realized that she wasn't looking at any of us. She was staring off into space like the top left corner of the classroom. So, staring at nothing, basically. One of the other students quietly said, "Miss," to try and get Mrs. Beaton to react. She slowly stood up, and as she did, so I could tell even then something was deeply wrong, she swayed on her feet, her breathing still heavily, and we still thought that it was just anger and outrage at Durst. Mrs. Beaton took a few unsteady steps out from behind her desk and into the center of the classroom. The desk had been arranged in a sort of U-shape around the teacher's desk, so there was a central space where we'd congregate if we played the instruments. Right now, it was empty, and this is where Mrs. Beaton walked. The whole time, she was staring into space. Then, she reached up with her right hand and gripped her chest suddenly and viscerally. Then, she sort of shook a few times on the spot, let out a strangled cry, and dropped to the ground, a dead weight. Literally, I discover later Mrs. Beaton had suffered a massive, devastating heart attack and a brain aneurysm. And to those of us who saw it happen, we'd swear it occurred as a result of sudden trauma. It felt like Durst had shocked dear sweet Miss Burton into having a heart attack with his performance of that song. Of course, we didn't know it was a heart attack at the time, or even that she was dead. First, there was panic, and some kids running to get another teacher, and breathless explanations of how Durst had burst into class and performed a song resulting in Mrs. Beaton dropping to the ground. And then there was more chaos, and paramedics, and teachers crying and guiding students out of the classroom carefully. And then finally, all of us kids were saying one thing to each other under our breaths. Durst killed Mrs. Beaton. The next few weeks must have been awfully difficult and complicated for the other teachers. Mrs. Beaton was beloved among staff as well, of course, and it's really hard to argue that Durst didn't kill Mrs. Beaton, even though he obviously didn't mean to, or even mean to harm her. But adult teachers can't go accusing a 12-year-old boy of killing their 76-year-old colleague because she had a heart attack in response to his bad behavior. They still had to treat that bad behavior in the same way they would have normally treated it. Unfortunately for them, they all knew they'd been complacent with Durst, and if they suddenly acted differently, it would imply that they believed that he was at fault. Now, I have a bit of insight here, so I know that his parents had had plenty of meetings with the school, and the teachers panicked and worrying about the psychological effect that it would have on their son if he fully blamed himself for Mrs. Beaton dying. On the other hand, they understood that he couldn't be allowed to believe that he held no responsibility either because his bad behavior had led to something terrible happening. So basically, the teachers and his parents decided that he should be punished, but not too much. Simply moving schools wasn't an option at first, and they also decided that it could make Durst internalize too much guilt. So basically, it meant that Durst got a handful of detentions, and our music teacher was dead. In the eyes of his angry classmates, who all knew we bore a bit of guilt, too. This meant that Durst had gotten away with murder, literally. We only had a few weeks left for summer term, and I think most of us were too shell-shocked at seeing Mrs. Beaton die to literal cringe to actually act on it. Then, we all received counseling, although surprisingly little concerning that we'd seen a woman die in front of our eyes. And our class also had a special assembly without Durst, where the headmistress herself emphasized strongly that while Durst's behavior had been unacceptable, it was very important that we all realized that Durst did not intentionally harm Mrs. Beaton, and that she was very old, and we all had our part to play and blah blah blah. We were little kids and not very compassionate, and also certainly didn't want to admit that we all egged Dur. And so instead, we spent the summer seething and plotting with our friends, and talking about how we were going to make Durst pay in the autumn term. Honestly, I think we were surprised that he even actually showed up at school in September. I didn't know until later that moving schools would have been a really awkward and difficult option, so I'd genuinely just been expecting never to see Durst again. The kid who showed up at the start of Year 8 was a very different boy to the Durst of Year 7. Haunted is the best word to describe him. Clearly, if there was one person who blamed Durst for Mrs. Beaton's death, it was Durst himself. On the first day of class, he walked up to our form room teacher and handed over a note, and then quietly sat in his seat. The teacher read the note and addressed the class to ask if we would call Durst by his real name, Ben, going forward, and then moved on with taking register. Durst or Ben just kept to himself after that, and he barely spoke to anyone, and when he did it was because he had to. He most certainly did not listen to Limp Bizkit or any music in the corridors, and he did not attend music class. And now that I think about it, it's kind of ghoulish that the rest of our class still had the lesson in the same classroom we'd seen Mrs. Beaton die in. But hey-ho, here we go. The new teacher was young and inexperienced, and some of the boys in the class would make half-hearted jokes about how the role was cursed because of Mrs. Beaton. But nobody really got mad at them for it, because we all knew that the respect that we had for her was good. And we were all still mad at Durst, though, and refused to call him Ben, despite what we'd been asked. We called him Durst, or Killer, and made absolutely no secret of the fact that we blamed him for murdering Mrs. Beaton. One of our favorite ways of tormenting him was to sing the ABBA song When I Kissed the Teacher, but change the lyrics to Killed, which was deeply cruel in retrospect. And I'm pretty sure some of the boys got in some more trouble for bullying Durst than Durst ever got into the year before any of his behavior. And while I think the teachers should have been tougher with Durst in the first place, I do think it's right that they cracked down on his bullying. L. Durst or Ben had very obviously not intended to do anything more than scandalize Mrs. Beaton. Certainly not kill her. And even then, as a kid, I could tell that he was deeply haunted and guilty about it. It was like Mrs. Beaton's ghost lurked around him. In fact, some kids started saying that. There was a rumor that if you looked at Durst at just the right angle, you could see Mrs. Beaton's apparition in his shadow or in his reflection. We'd share this rumor just loud enough for Durst himself to hear. And more than once, I caught him staring at his reflection or his shadow in a very nervous way. And throughout Year 8, it eventually just became set in stone fact that A, Durst had killed Mrs. Beaton, and B, Mrs. Beaton's ghost was now haunting Durst. The bullying continued, and no matter how severely the teachers tried to punish us, we would not stop calling Durst a killer and telling him he was haunted. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreaditsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I think I've had just about a goddamn enough.